Okay, well, welcome to Caring for a Loved One with Alzheimer's, a panel for real life experiences. My name is Lorraine Krim. I'm the Senior Services Program Manager at Coconino County, and I will be moderating this presentation today. So first, I'll go over a few Zoom rules for today. While it's usually wonderful to see the faces of our audiences, for this particular presentation, we'd like to ask that all attendees turn their cameras off. This will help ensure that when you're viewing your screen, you'll be able to see all the panel members that will be speaking when on gallery view. We ask you to also keep your microphones off during the presentation to ensure that all panel members can be heard. There will, however, be a time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. So please do save your questions for the end. And at that time, we'd love for you to go ahead and turn on your camera and your microphone if you like. You can also, as you think of questions throughout the presentation, you're welcome to drop them in the chat. Just know that we won't be answering the questions until the end. You probably already saw that the presentation is being recorded. This is so that anyone who wasn't able to attend or down the road might want to watch the presentation on our YouTube channel at a later date. So everyone's experience with Alzheimer's is unique. Some experiences are very different from one another and some have similarities. There is no normal. But you can be assured that you are not alone in feeling like you are having an abnormal experience. We are here today to share with you experiences of 4 different caregivers that have lost loved ones to Alzheimer's. We have today with us Patty Gurley, Karen Bonkay, and Tim Whiteside, and also Gabby Short, who's filling in for Shireen Short, who had an emergency. So I'm going to go ahead and call on each panelist in the order that they appear on my screen and have them give just a quick 1-minute introduction of themselves. You'll also see Candace Kanker popping on camera from time to time. She's helping me keep time and monitor the chat. But let's go ahead and get started with introductions. Tim, you're first on my screen.
Okay, yay. Hi, I'm Tim Whiteside. My experience with Alzheimer's was with my wife. She had early onset Alzheimer's, so that's a bit unique in the world. I am still a working professional here in town, and we dealt with her Alzheimer's for 7 years before she passed away, which was about 1.5 years ago.
Thank you. Patty?
Hi, so I'm Patty Gorley, and my experience with Alzheimer's is through my mom and my grandfather. I was too young to be my grandfather's caregiver, but I helped with my mom, and so it was probably about 9 years from her first symptoms to when she passed away. And so I do a lot of volunteering with Alzheimer's, Late Alzheimer's Association, and then with Nazada, who's presenting this education seminar.
Thank you. Karen, can you introduce yourself, please?
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I am a Dementia Friends champion, and I was a caregiver for my mother, and she and I were the only family that each other had. She had a traumatic fall, and that just made everything come undone for her. And it was the lowest time of my life for 7 years. I was powerless to stop what was happening to her.
Thank you. Gabby?
Hello, everyone. My name is Gabby Short, and I had the lovely opportunity to be the caregiver for my great grandmother. I was very young when she came about with her diagnosis per se, so I may not be a full expert. However, I know that at that time, my grandfather, my Nana's husband, was kind of in denial that she was having Alzheimer's, but I do know that she also had it for over 20 years. And yeah, she's a champion.
Thank you. Thank you for those introductions, everyone. Now we'll go ahead and get into the body of the presentation. The first question I'll ask, and we'll continue going in the same order for this question, is please share your diagnosis experience with us. Tim?
Okay. Yeah. I don't know if ours was typical or not, since I've got an experience of one here, but my wife was having some mild concerns about her memory, so she told me at the time, and we were in the process of changing family doctors, and that came a time to go to the doctor and meet the doctor and talk about any health concerns, and I was with her during that time. I shared my stuff, and she brought up that she had some minor concerns about memory. And at that point, we were both 58 and we're over the hill, and what's the memory doing? And is this normal or not? It's just getting older. But so she was brave enough to ask the question. And it was the most wonderful, horrible thing that happened at that point, because the doctor, instead of saying, oh, you need to go see so-and-so, says, well, I have a little 30-question thing I can give you right now. And no time for us to think about it, or, oh, we'll come back, or maybe, yeah, thanks, we'll consider that. So it was, and perhaps everyone has had this experience. It's quite a standard question and answer activity. And we went through that, and the doctor says, let me talk to some of my friends about this. And of course, our ears went up and we went, oh, okay, great, thanks. So he was consulted with others, came back to us with a suggestion that maybe my wife should have a CAT scan to see if perhaps there was something going on with the stroke. He said that the results of the 30 questions were not great. And then she went through that and confirmed that, yeah, there's nothing else going on. So he referred us to a local neuropsychiatrist who went and interviewed her, and we're impressed with her. My wife was very comfortable with her, very friendly with her, and she recommended a full day of questions and answers and different screening activities. It was an entire day. I dropped my wife off at her office in the morning, and everyone was full of trepidation, and the neuropsych did such a great job of reassuring my wife that, no, this is nothing, this isn't like taking a college entrance exam. And so I left her there through the day and came back at the end of the day and got a little summary report that she said nothing really about how the results had gone, but just stressed that and encouraged my wife that, you did fine and nothing to worry about here. And, we'll schedule a follow-up. So, I tried to ask my wife how things were and what all she did. And even at that point, I was getting kind of general answers from her. But okay, well, you have lots of puzzles and you did fun things and drawing and questions and all kinds of things like that. Okay, fine. So a couple of weeks passed, and the doctor called back and wanted to set up a time to go over the results. I said, okay, that's fine, we'll do it. It turned out to be on October 31st, Halloween. And my first awareness really that this was not going to be a good appointment is he said, you might want to bring your daughter. Okay, why? Yeah, so I understood at that point that this was going to be the talk that I didn't really want to hear. So my daughter, sure enough, came with me and with our newborn grandson, and the doctor and Linda. And the doctor went through all of the test results and marveled at her cognitive reserve, which I think was her kind way of saying she really screened this disease very well from everyone. And she was quite a ways along. In fact, she counseled us to have her immediately stop driving, which we ignored. That'll be a story I'll share after a bit, perhaps. But it was a very extensive report, and I was very impressed with the work she did and the careful analysis and every one of the assessments that she'd gone through. And so then the finish of the diagnosis really was all pointers were toward Alzheimer's. There could have been other things and dementia going on. So now was the choice of a doctor. So the final activity really of the diagnosis stage was, okay, who can we find neurologists that we can trust? And was told pretty much at that time, the local Flagstaff is way overworked and maybe this is going to require selecting someone in Phoenix. So I didn't really challenge that and was fine. And so really the recommendations were from her anyways, and I've learned there's lots of different options out there, was probably between Barrows Neurological or Mayo. And so the suggestion was that perhaps Barrows would have more of a team approach to dealing with the sickness. So we made appointment and was dismayed that it was a 6-month delay to see a neurologist. So now we have a diagnosis, all the angst of what does this mean? Is it true? And no way to really expedite it. Well, Barrows was able to speed things up a little bit, but we had quite a long delay. So we went down, had the introductory appointment, same 30-question screening test given by this high-priced neurologist, but he was very good in the field, and we had got quite a good relationship with him as things went along. But he wouldn't really state any opinions after that. He said, you need to have a CAT scan. My wife was afraid of enclosed spaces. And had she not been as far along as she was in the disease, there is no way on earth we could have gotten her into the tube for the screen. But she was positive, and we, several weeks later, as more delay, got the CAT scan done, got the MRI done, back to the doctor in Phoenix, and he made the official diagnosis at that point that he was able to look, found the plaque, explained what they had seen, and said yes. And she had a little bit of a minor difference in her disease coming more behind her eye. And I never was quite clear exactly what that meant, but that was the diagnosis. So that was our diagnosis experience. The dismaying part was really the time it took to get to that.
Thank you, Tim. Patty, can you share your diagnosis experience, please?
So mine was more longer on the front end. So I think it, in retrospect, we should have had her diagnosed, my mom diagnosed a lot sooner, because her father passed away from Alzheimer's. And so my mom was kind of always prepared that, it would come to her. And so I guess I thought that she would recognize signs and come to us, or my, I don't, my parents live in Prescott and I live in Flagstaff. So I just thought that them looking for it, it would be, oh, okay, well, she's showing signs, and she would go willingly. And, it was really probably about 4 years of symptoms before we actually got her diagnosed. And she, I guess my situation's a little unique in that my mom historically had a lot of allergies. She didn't sleep very well. And I mean, I didn't know at the time that is a symptom of Alzheimer's, is having trouble sleeping, but she had always had that because of her allergies, lots of headaches. And so, a lot of her behavior, my dad related to this lack of sleep issues, which can, over time, have somewhat similar symptoms. But, my mom was getting very, angry, very selfish, which wasn't like her. She became paranoid, which, is obviously a symptom of Alzheimer's. And so what my sister and I ultimately had to do was we referred to the Alzheimer Association website, and there's a kind of like a cheat sheet of the 10 early signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's, and they compare them to like kind of what's a normal aging. My mom was mid-late 60s at the time, but what's normal aging versus Alzheimer's. So my sister and I went through that and identified a lot that, probably 8 out of the 10 my mom had. And so we went to my dad and said, hey, we think this is what's going on, and kind of convinced him, like he was with her every day, but didn't recognize it. So, and again, this was all based on, we thought she would kind of self-recognize after her experience with her dad. And so when we finally, my sister and my dad and I all came and talked to my mom, and she totally related it to her sleeping issues, but it got us to a neurologist. So we convinced her that she was having enough issues. Like she was, no way is it Alzheimer's, I would know, whatever. But we got her to a neurologist just because, well, you're having sleeping issues and it's causing all these other issues. And so, and ultimately I was not with my dad during the actual diagnosis and the test, but it was this kind of long, painful few years, 4 years really of her having, and so we obviously should have, that's, I guess, one of the reasons why I do what I do and volunteer and share experiences, is because I think I personally, after what she went through with her dad, if she was aware that she had Alzheimer's, that it would make, I guess, selfishly make me feel better, because she would be like, oh, okay, I have Alzheimer's. But she was too far along when we got her diagnosed for her to even have that perception, I guess. So anyway, that was kind of rambling. It was kind of all before diagnosis, but we ultimately got her diagnosed because she thought this neurologist would help her with her sleeping issues. So anyway, that's it for me.
Thank you for that, Patty. Karen?
Well, we noticed changes in my mother, but they were very subtle changes. And we just thought, oh, it's the normal part of aging. She was developing a tremor, and we asked the doctor about it, and he just kind of blew it off. Didn't realize that she had the symptoms of Parkinson's, which goes along with Alzheimer's for many people. And the experience was really awful. After she recovered from the traumatic fall that she had broken a shoulder and a tooth. About 2 months later, the doctor sent her to a neurologist. The person she saw was a nurse practitioner, and she quickly gave my mother a few things to do. It took maybe 10 minutes if we stretched it, and she said, okay, she's got Alzheimer's. She gave us prescriptions and said the medication would help for a while. We both knew that she had a cognitive challenge before the appointment, but being told point blank, coldly, without any empathy, it was just so devastating. It was like the rug had been pulled out from underneath our feet.
Thank you for that, Karen. Gabby, are you able to share your diagnosis experience? Gabby, I'm not hearing your audio. I'm not sure what's going on. Are others, Tim, and are you able to hear her?
No.
Okay. Gabby, I think we'll have to come back to you. Okay. So we'll move on to the next topic here, which is so once you've received the diagnosis, what happens next? What happened next? Tim?
Yeah, so we had the diagnosis there at Barrows. And I think one of my major disappointments in the process at this point was I had been told and felt that there would be a team. There would be social people involved. There would be other, the neurologist is one little component of this whole business, and there was not. So in terms of follow-up with social care and what other things are out there other than working with the local, this group here and attending some things, I was totally unprepared for really what to do next, frankly. The neurologist was great. Like I said, we stayed with him for years, but he had his little narrow box. And he said, oh yeah, Barrows, we have social workers and things, and never anything. They had an eye specialist that was supposed to help out, and she was too busy getting her office remodeled to even return calls. And I was pretty much alone. I was fortunate to have two daughters that were very involved and concerned with things. So kind of a little bit of muddling along. We did have prescriptions. I did a lot of reading, reaching out just to seminars and things to understand. I was not really, with where she was in the disease, there wasn't a lot of, oh, we can go try to slow the process down with, there's all these people trying to sell stuff. And I found that was not really a decent path to follow. We did what we could, tried to keep her engaged and mind involved and things in the early stages. The two things that were really important for me as far as the next steps is, and I would counsel anyone if they haven't already gotten this, is get an attorney as fast as you possibly can. If you have an Alzheimer's diagnosis, you've got to take care of the stuff. I was 58. Worrying about estate and that kind of things was the farthest thing from my mind. And to suddenly realize you got to get papers, you got to get the right to sign for your spouse and deal with that stuff. So we found a good elder attorney in Phoenix, and she sat us down and went through all of the paperwork and the whole estate, helped us understand if there was any opportunities to get our financial situation into a position where maybe if things get really bad, can the state help out? And just answered a ton of questions. So that was a vital first step. And following up on that was then dealing with financial institutions and getting the financial papers to them and following up on all of that. My wife was to the point where the attorneys were kind in agreeing that she knew what she was signing. And it had she'd gotten to that point very quickly after the diagnosis. And I was kind of shocked that, she was making an X on a piece of paper to sign her name. But that was very relieving. I would also suggest that there's all kinds of things online. You can do paperwork. And even though I hired a very fine attorney to help draw up the papers, one of our local banking institutions would not accept it. And that's tough when you're trying to access IRA money and paying for all of this stuff that's happening. So really, that was probably the one bright thing that maybe I did during this whole process. But I'd suggest that was probably the next step. Then outside of that was really kind of looking at where she was, and she was still working part-time, and how long can we keep going with that. But just having the diagnosis raised awareness and really helped us just be planning for the next steps.
Thank you, Tim. Patty?
So again, my experience was a lot different than Tim's. And again, obviously, because my mom, a lot of different reasons, but I think it was because my mom had gone through the experience with my grandfather, who was actually a lawyer, that they had all their paperwork in order. I mean, it was probably, they had it all in order. I mean, 10 years before. I mean, they were
Yeah.
just, they were ready. So that was one thing I didn't have to worry about. So that was a relief. And, you know, my dad, if my mom's Alzheimer's on one side, my dad is one of those super ager people. So he's got this amazing brain. And so he took care of a lot of that. So really what we did after diagnosis was just trying to manage expectations and how to care for her and to learn, because you would think that with the history of Alzheimer's in our family, we would have done some due diligence, you know, over the years to be ready, but we didn't. And so I know my dad, he's a very analytical kind of computer person, not a big, I don't want to say touchy-feely, but anyway, he reached out to the Alzheimer Association and got some materials, and he could tell you in detail all the medical aspects of Alzheimer's. I mean, he's amazing, and he's still amazing to this day with all that. But and so really, I guess it was a learning process, and I think the biggest thing for us was how to deal with the behavior issues at home. So how to, I mean, you know, she started to be, you know, I guess there was things about Alzheimer's we didn't realize. And I know, you know, my dad always says, once you meet someone with Alzheimer's, you've met one person with Alzheimer's, because people's brains are so different. They're just such a different experience. And so, you know, my mom, you know, loved to read. I mean, as soon as she retired in her 50s, and she had 3 newspapers sent to the house, and she would read them every day. She had no interest in reading, and come to find out, like, she couldn't follow the lines anymore. She couldn't read a calendar. She couldn't tell time. She was an avid sewer, and she had the same sewing machine. You know, her dad gave it to her as a graduation present, and it was just, she had taken it apart in pieces on her desk and didn't know what to do with it. So, I mean, and then she was getting, you know, more angry and frustrated. And so, you know, it was a difficult time, because you know, you always, you know, my preconceived notions about Alzheimer's was that the person gets angry and stays angry, and they're difficult to deal with. And so here's my mom, you know, I mean, she's a completely, like, no mobility issues, no other disease, just she's a spunky, healthy person. And so to see her turn and get somewhat aggressive, I was just, you know, I was kind of, you know, I mean, you love your parents, and I, you know, but it was just, you know, she would be so angry, and so I mean, nothing, I mean, she's not shouting obscenities or anything, but just so unlike her, very short, very abrupt, very selfish. And so I kind of distance from her, and that was an internal struggle that was very hard for me, because here's a time where I should be loving and supporting my mom, and it was very hard for me to be there. And so but I was, you know, but it was a very difficult time. And I think that, you know, in hindsight, we were scrambling and trying to learn, and I think that's, you know, learn. I mean, you don't say, okay, so what do you want for dinner? You say, do you want chicken or you want beef? I mean, so just those simple, like, tactics to understand behavior and how to deal with them is kind of what we did, you know, that post-diagnosis time. So
Thank you for that, Patty. Karen, are you ready to share?
Yes, after the diagnosis, my mother had been living independently in her home. We had home health care coming in every day to check on her and go over her progress. And one day the phone rang, and it was the nurse, and he said, I've been ringing the doorbell and your mother's not answering. And I peeked in around the blinds, and I can see her lying on the floor. So she had fallen. I had talked to her at 4 o'clock the day before, and she fell shortly after that and laid there all night until 11 o'clock the next day, when the nurse found her. She wound up in the hospital, and for some reason I had the presence of mind to tell the doctor I cannot tell her she can't live alone anymore. I need you to tell her. I didn't realize how really important that is, because when our loved one is so dependent upon us and the care that we give them, to turn around and say, you can't live here anymore is devastating, and it harms the relationship. I was very fortunate that the doctor agreed to do that. There was no problem. I placed her in a private care home over in East Flagstaff, and I don't know, I think the atmosphere wasn't really very positive, but I also know she was terribly, terribly depressed, and she wouldn't talk much. And when she did talk, she would say horrific things to me. She didn't use curse words, but they were exquisitely painful. And somehow I knew to just sit there and take it. I never argued with her. In some years past, when she was going through the various stages, one day she was present and she said, I want to talk to you. I know I've said some terrible things to you and I don't know why, but you never argued with me and you had every right to. You must love me very much. So it was how I was making her feel. I was not arguing with her. I was not making her feel less of a person. While she was living in this care home, my husband and I were both working. We would go and pick her up on Saturday and Sunday, bring her out to our house, have meals with her, watch favorite cooking shows that she liked. She didn't really talk much. When Christmas came, they had a group come in and sing Christmas carols, and I was surprised. It's the first time I recognized that people with Alzheimer's, even if they're not communicating at all or much, you give them a song that they know from way back when, and there was my mother belting out Christmas carols. That was wonderful to see. So it just was a very hard time because I didn't know how to communicate. That was the hardest thing for me. If I would have understood where she was at in her timeline. Was she back 30 years, 40 years? It never entered my mind. There were no resources to reach out. No doctor or neurologist ever suggested that I check these things out. I was clueless. It was just a very, very painful time. There is so much more that I could have put into the relationship with her if I would have known to go back 30, 40, 50 years and engage her in the timeline where she was at. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Gabby, I see you exited and came back. You want to see if your audio is working and if you could share with us about both the diagnosis and what happened after diagnosis.
Yes, can you hear me better now?
We can, thank you.
Yay, okay, great. Sorry, take two, right? So the diagnosis, like I mentioned earlier, I was a little bit younger, so I wasn't 100% sure how that diagnosis process went. However, I am 25 years myself, and so my entire childhood, my Nana has always had Alzheimer's. Growing up, I actually had to go stay with some other family members just because that's when my family acknowledged that she was starting to really, have memory issues and things like that. So that's kind of when I knew that I always needed to be my Nana's extra eyes and kind of watch after her. My grandfather was also a very primary role when he was with us. But he passed away the day after my 12th birthday, and that's when myself and my mother and my great aunt, we became primary caregivers for my Nana. So I had to grow up very early and learn that I needed to take care of her. So again, I know that she's had it my entire childhood.
Is this an emergency? Okay,
And then for us, for kind of what happened next, with that being said, again, my grandfather passed. We went into living with my Nana because we knew that if we were to move my Nana into a nursing home, that she wouldn't thrive or do the best that she could. So our family decided to keep her in her home, and we took, my mom and I would live with her for a week, and then my great aunt and her husband would live with her with a week. Growing up, my friends were like, "Oh, are your parents divorced?" I'm like, "No, I just help take care of my Nana." So that was a big role for us, is making sure that her environment stays same. However, we change in and out. Growing up with my Nana, she went through different stages of, she was able to move, but it went from just making sure that, you sit down and have lunch with her so she would remember to eat, or sometimes she would pick something up and be like, "Oh, this is so important, let me go put it away." But then in reality, we never could find it again. So for us, it was definitely a lot of stages, but overall, it was just keeping her consistent in her home where she knew that she belonged and it was normal. And again, the three primary caregivers for her were all women. So that was myself, my mom, and my great aunt. So she, even later on, when her Alzheimer's progressed and she became not as verbal with us, she still knew that we were familiar and that we were a safe place for her.
Thank you, Gabby.
You're welcome.
Karen, you had mentioned joining your mother where she was 30, 40, 50 years ago. Did you have any other tips on communication that you wanted to share?
Absolutely. Every minute is a new minute in your relationship with someone taking this journey. You need to take a deep breath and think on your feet. And I found that communication is a very broad thing. It includes your body language. If you're sitting there with your arms crossed and got a frown, and the tone of your voice is important. Your loved one may not remember the conversation that they had with you or you with them, but what they will remember is how they were made to feel in this interaction. And that was the example with my mother, where she was saying those horrible things to me, and I never engaged and fought back with her. And for her, it made her feel like I must really love her. It's important that we never, ever argue. It doesn't matter how wrong they are, just don't argue. It makes the situation worse. And I urge you to lose phrases like, "Don't you remember?" or "I told you that yesterday," or I told you that 5 minutes ago. You just have to take a deep breath and find a way around it. And we never want to say no, especially, your loved one, if maybe they're back in their teen years, how did you react when your parents said no to you? How did we react? We got angry. We didn't like it. And maybe your loved one is asking for something and your reaction would naturally be no. But let's look at a scenario. Say she wants to bake a pie. She can't do that anymore. What you could try saying is, "Oh, I love how that place smells when you bake one of your delicious pies, especially apple. That's my favorite. The oven isn't working properly. A repair person is coming over to fix it next week. Let's put this off until then." Then you offer a diversion. Let's go for a walk, or give them a cookie or something to divert their attention. And what you have done is you've not said no. You've let your person know that you heard what it was they wanted to do. And you gave them an option to look for the future. Of course, they're not going to remember when next week comes along, and you may have to just keep up with that story. There are times when people say, I went to visit my loved one and she doesn't recognize me anymore. Well, think about where your loved one is at. Maybe she's 18, 20 years old, And in her mind, that's how she sees herself. And when she met you, you looked really different than you do right now. So she doesn't recognize you. You could just say, you know, I'm your friend Bob or whoever, and don't push, you know, well, I'm your husband. Don't you remember? We've been married for 40 years. It doesn't work. It doesn't make the situation better. Remember, it's how we're making our person feel. Those are some of my communication tips. And you'll get more if you choose to attend one of my Dementia Friends information sessions, and I will put that in the chat when I'm done.
Thank you, Karen. So let's talk about ambiguous loss. It's the type of loss that you feel when a person with dementia is physically here, but may not be mentally or emotionally present in the same way as before, complicating grief. I'll ask each of you to please share with us your experience with ambiguous loss. Tim, we'll start with you.
I'm going to take the opportunity to tag on to what Karen has shared with communication.
Sure.
She is spot on. The meeting your loved one wherever they are. That book, Planet Alzheimer's, was so central to my understanding of, you don't correct. If they're in their world, they are in their correct world. So never correcting the ability to violate a rule that we had as a married couple, which was never lie to one another. It's okay, a gentle lie. And just meeting her where she was a lot of the time, exactly as Karen pointed out, my wife was back in high school before we met in college. So it was like going way back, and she frequently thought I was perhaps her best not boyfriend, just friend growing up. And I never corrected her. I never really said, I'm your husband. I was the guy that was smiling and listening to her. And that's really all it took. The point of diversion, so excellent. Just, you know, when she would bring up something that's a difficult subject, I'm great at diverting a conversation. I'm sending it off in another direction, and never, you know, that always worked fine. I avoided lies sometimes by simply diverting the conversation. So those were great points you brought, and I just wanted to kind of echo that those really helped me live through those times. As far as ambiguous loss, that was a phrase that really wasn't a thing during my 7-year experience. It seems after my wife passed, a friend gave me the book Ambiguous Loss, and I went, oh, this is a marvelous book. It describes so many things that I've felt. Because there's a gradual losing of the person, right? Or it feels that way, or it's different. To me, the ambiguous loss was the gradual change from husband to caregiver. Husband, slightly caregiver, to a little bit husband, to caregiver, to just caregiver. And it was a taking and a taking and a taking of our relationship. And I felt very strongly this was my responsibility as a spouse, and that was all very fine. But it was really not until she passed that I kind of understood the feelings I was having. So I don't have a whole lot to share on that, although I can say that when she did pass, I thought that I would have been going through the grieving process, right, during all of that taking and taking and taking. And no, that didn't change what happened afterwards. So you may feel like you're losing and you're dealing with grief as you go along, but be aware that when the loved one passes, the grief is still there. That's my bit.
Thank you, Tim. Patty?
I'll just reinforce what Karen said and Tim said. I mean, all the hints that Karen provided were right on. I mean, that's kind of the point we got to. You know, my parents were both kind of more matter-of-fact, analytical people, so my dad really had trouble with even telling a little white lie, and so it just for survival and making it a more pleasant experience for my mom, that's what he ended up doing. But so my My experience with ambiguous loss kind of ebbed and flowed depending on the stage that my mom was in. Once, I think I said earlier that she was in kind of like initially in that angry stage, but once she kind of moved into the middle stage, she was this completely different person. She just basically succumbed to it, but she was happy. Like she was, loving on my dad. She was was just very, somewhat childlike, but not, I mean, that kind of progressed, but just this very different person than I grew up with. We would sit and people watch. So they were in Prescott and she couldn't remember anything that happened in her day. So we would sit on the square in Prescott and just talk about people that walked by. My mom would never have done that. I mean, she was just always up and moving and doing stuff. So, after I kind of got over the initial feeling of like, who is this person? I actually really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed my time with her. And we had a lot of good conversations that I probably never would have had with her. But once she kind of progressed into what I call kind of her last communicative type of stage, that's where I think I experienced the greatest amount of loss because, she was, we had these fine conversations and then she just got to where she was very, she lost interest in eating and drinking, walking. I mean, she was one of the, she was the person that walked around that was just, didn't need any help, didn't need a walker. And she's in this care home with all these people that are struggling. And she was always perky. So she didn't need to use a walker or didn't need to use a wheelchair. She just lost interest and didn't want to do anything. And so it was, that was really difficult. And so I struggled with that a lot. And I would go and I'd see her and, I could, she'd raise an eyebrow. I mean, she wouldn't talk. She got to where she didn't talk, but when I would come see her, she would kind of raise an eyebrow at me, like she knew I was somebody significant, but she didn't speak. Once in a while, I would be talking and she would repeat a word, or, I'd lean in to give her a kiss on the cheek and she'd actually like pucker. And so it was just those things that kind of meant a lot to me. But it was, I think there was a lot of, I mean, I think I went through my hardest time at that moment than I did after she passed away. And I didn't have any relief when she passed away, but it was more like, I think I had already gone through part of the process. But again, it was not my spouse. So, I mean, that would be a very different situation. So, thank you.
Thank you, Patty. Karen?
Tim, you brought up an interesting topic, and that was the white lie. And I'd like to address that. My mother had asked where my stepfather was. She wanted to see him. Now, he was her high school sweetheart, but they didn't get married until they were in their 40s. So they had a long history together, but for some reason in her mind, she didn't understand that he was deceased. And I had the presence of mind to say to her, he's out fixing the car. I didn't say, he died, don't you remember? Which so many times you hear people say, well, I'm just going to keep telling him or her, no matter how many times they ask, he died or she died. And what happens is your person will be very upset that they didn't remember that their loved one passed, and they will grieve all over again. And remember what I said, it's about how we make someone feel. So if we tell a little white lie and it keeps things calm and doesn't get them upset, in my book, that's a good thing. I didn't know the term ambiguous loss back in 2002 through 2009 when I was on this journey with my mother. But I did know I was grieving because I felt sorrow all the time. I lived for the moments when she was present every once in a while, and that was like a gift to me. And my mother retained her sense of humor sometimes. She says, I don't have Alzheimer's. I don't forget things all the time. I have Partzheimer's. And I just thought that was very, very precious. It just, the ambiguous loss is just exquisitely painful. The hospital called me when my mother was in what they call, strange term, active dying stage. And I went and I stayed there for like 18 hours and she was not conscious, but I know that hearing is the last thing to go. And I held her hand and I sang songs from my childhood that she sang to me. And I recalled funny things, stories that she told me as a child. And the amazing thing was, while I was holding her hand, every once in a while, she'd give me a little squeeze. So to me, she was letting me know that she heard me. She knew I was there, that I was helping her with her journey. And it's something you will never, ever, ever forget. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Gabby?
Yes, I think I can relate to many of you as well. Well, for example, with my mother, my mom had an opportunity where, and so I know for my mom, it was really hard to, know who her Nana was when she was growing up, because she raised my mom, to being a caregiver, and then, seeing her, change over the time. And I think one thing that was kind of big for the majority of my family is my Nana was kind of always like, to the point, let's get it done. Not stern, but she just meant business. And, as time progressed for her, she became more like, well, the trees are dancing and this, and like when they would sway back and forth, she would always tell us the trees are dancing, or, she just always saw like the beauty in things that we would never expect. And so it was always nice to kind of see her, like the nice, soft, gentle side that would come out. And for me, my Nana, of course, would always be like, oh, I love you, I'll see you later. But for my mom, growing up, again, she was, a little bit more, I guess, stern, overall. And she didn't really express, I love you. But as she progressed with her Alzheimer's, she kept telling my mom more and more, like, I love you and I love you. And I know that was a lot for my mom, as well as my aunt, which is my Nana's daughter. So kind of just saying that. And yeah, just kind of saying, of course, them progressing, but with my Nana, it brought out a different side that we didn't experience before.
Thank you, Gabby. Patty, can you please share with us your experience with assisted living?
So for us, I know that I guess our situation was the hardest part. The easiest part, I guess, was to decide that that's where she would be happiest. Because as I said, my parents were they were married. I mean, they married in college, but they were very independent people. Like, they never did each other's laundry. They did their own. It wasn't like they had a good relationship, but they just were very independent. And so to have the role of my dad telling her, you need to brush your teeth, you need to take a shower, it just made her angry. And there was just so much friction. And so thankfully, my parents have really good long-term care insurance. There was a Highgate facility within a mile from my parents' home in Prescott. And so my dad, and again, my mom, because she was pretty far along when we got her diagnosed, and this was 2 years later, we finally moved her into memory care, or into assisted living. So our choice was that, my dad didn't need help, but he said that he would move with her to make the transition easier, and he kept their home. And so, but the hardest part was getting her there. And so, and I'm sure I know a lot of the care facilities have this where you can just come for a meal, come for, a game or whatever. So we did some of the socialization with her, and this is nothing against Highgate, but just the name Highgate offended my mom because they have a high gate. And that's what she would talk about. Like you have to drive by Highgate to get into their neighborhood. And so as much as we socialized, she was very resistant. And so, so what we ultimately had to do was, we picked a date to move. I mean, she didn't understand dates. And so my sister just basically took her out for the day. They spent the day together. And while anything that was significant to her in her room, we basically moved all her stuff and brought the significant things to her. We had pictures on the wall. We had her favorite blanket. We had just those things and the whole, like some of her needlework. So we, through the day, just like got our whole family together and we just moved everything. And so, so my sister brought her in to the facility and, she came up to the apartment. They got a 2-bedroom apartment. And so we sat down and talked and we went and had dinner. Everyone was relaxed. It was good. And then she picked up her purse and said she was ready to go home. And so, so we, my dad obviously had his bedroom there and my sister and I, we had the pull-out couch. And so we convinced her that first night to stay just because her closest loved ones were going to stay. And so, she adapted pretty well after that. But again, she progressed for the slow beginning. She progressed pretty fast. So we were, maybe my dad stayed with her there for about 6 months, but she was a wanderer. And so what my dad thought would help is they had this certain view of this Thumb Butte in Prescott from her house. And so he waited for a room at Highgate that really had the same view. It was a little different, but you could see Thumb Butte, thinking that, oh, that would give her comfort. But and they didn't live in that home very long in Prescott. So it wasn't like it was a 20, 30-year home or something, but she just knew, I guess it wasn't home. And so since they were just in the assisted living portion, there's no control of, like, there's no locked doors. And so she started getting out of the facility. And so at that time, we moved her to memory care and my dad moved home. And so, the memory care experience was a little rough just because she was one of those healthy people that moved around. And so they didn't give her a lot of attention because she didn't seem to need it, even though, and the whole thing about getting out of the facility was fixed because they had the locked doors. And so, but as she progressed, she was in the ER a couple times in 3 weeks because she was dehydrated. She wasn't drinking, she wasn't eating. So what we actually had to do is my dad hired 11 hours a day, hired a nurse from Comfort Keepers to stay with her in the memory care facility, just to give her the care she needed. And that was the best thing that we ever did. I mean, it was very difficult to see my mom kind of she looked to this person for a lot of, she would just hear her voice and she would smile more reaction than she had when she would see me. But this person was, again, so before we hired her in, my mom was getting real agitated. And I think it was the dehydration and the not eating, and she would tap on stuff and that kind of thing, like very agitated. And once she, they would sit there for an hour to eat. She would make sure she had enough nourishment, enough water. And my mom was just very relaxed. And so I feel like, and one more point and then I'll end, but one of the best things was that, again, because my parents had the relationship they had, once she was there and my dad wasn't the one telling her to brush her teeth or whatever, they were totally happy. She loved him coming in and seeing him. She would hold his hand, she would kiss on him. And it was just this very relaxed, loving relationship. And that was, I know it's not for everyone to go into assisted living or memory care, but it worked really well for my parents' situation. So, but anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you for sharing that, Patty. And I know, Tim, you did have experience with caregiving at the home. Can you please share that experience with us?
Sure. When we got the diagnosis and as she was needing to have someone with her more as I was working, one thing I did know from our relationship is that we both felt that we should grow old in our home. So I was very comfortable with reaching out to see what I could find for in-home caregiving, and found one of the local agencies, and it was the right solution for us for most of her time. The advantages of having a local agency is they had rotation of people, which was a plus and a minus, because sometimes it wasn't the same caregiver that could come in each day, but they tried to manage that and have kind of a prime person that was there most of the time. And they would come in flexible hours, whatever I needed. Generally, it was during the work week, pretty much full time. On the weekends, less. Depends on if I was available or whatever. And that left me in a better place to be her caregiver in the evenings, and in the morning, getting her up and around. I could continue working. And I really appreciated their flexibility in the hours. They were very flexible on exactly what needed to be done. They helped with some housekeeping much of the time, as Patty just mentioned, just sitting with her, helping her eat, but just sitting and watching TV or chatting or just being the friend on the couch next to her. And the folks that they brought in, I felt safe in our house. And my wife never once had a problem with that. I know that's a problem frequently with folks, but for whatever reasons, and maybe she was far enough along that she didn't worry about who it was. It was a smiling face and friendly. So I had just a great experience with that. Oh, until COVID, and they all disappeared. So we were past that. We won't talk about that any further, but that redefined my caregiving role for a couple of years. But as soon as that passed, they were back. So I felt very comfortable with it. When she needed more care, I kind of had some question about whether it was time for a facility, but we managed. My one daughter had moved back in with me with her family during COVID, so there was extra people around to kind of help until toward the very end when we did use hospice services. But the in-home caregiving was very good. I had more concern about how to pay for it, perhaps, but I was fortunate enough to be able to draw on retirement funds, and that all worked.
Okay, thank you. Karen, can you talk a little bit about advocacy for your mother?
Being an advocate for your loved one is just so incredibly important, because they are so dependent upon you for taking care of things. And my mother did wind up in another assisted living facility, and while she was happy there and it was a much nicer environment, I had to watch out because sometimes things fell through the cracks. I went to put something in her dresser drawer and found a drawer full of pills, all different pills. And what I learned was that when the caregiver came in to hand her medication in a little cup, she said, "Oh, well, I'll take it in a little while." And she threw it in the drawer. So that was not helping her. And I brought it to their attention. And, you're not being a pest. You have to be vigilant about everything. I mean, I went there one day and my mother had no glasses. She couldn't see without her glasses. I hadn't been there the day before. You would think somebody would have called and said, your mother lost her glasses. So, I called the eye doctor. I got a rush shipment FedExed of the last prescription that she had so she could see. And it's so easy for our loved ones to fall through the cracks if we are not being vigilant about their needs and how their needs are being addressed or not. You know, I'm not talking about being rude, but we have to be firm and polite. You know, you're paying for something, whether it's a caregiver in your home or at a facility.
Thank you, Karen. Gabby, I know you and your mother cared for your Nana at home. Do you want to share some of your experience with that? And also, I know you and your mom did a lot to adjust things with nutrition throughout the many years. So if you want to talk a little bit about that too, that would be great.
Perfect. Like I mentioned, I was very young when I became a caregiver role. So also teaching. So we would have a family friend who would come and stay with my Nana during the day. And then after that year passed, my great aunt or my aunt retired, and she became, her caregiver mostly during the days. But like I mentioned, my mom and I would stay with her one week, as well as my aunt, my uncle. But what our kind of dynamic would look like when my mom and I would go to school for me, or my mom would work, it would come down and stay with my Nana during the day. So that's kind of just how it worked for us. Again, when it was our week again, we would come back and my aunt would go home and still have that opportunity to, go do things at her home and spend time with her family and things like that. So we did that for about 13 years. Of course, we had our experiences throughout it, but I overall think by keeping my grandma or my Nana in her home, I definitely think it kept her very comfortable, very familiar. She was very witty, and she'd be like, "Oh, you're my next babysitter." And you're like, "I'm not a babysitter. I'm just here to hang out with you." Also, it's kind of interesting too, because with being a younger caregiver, she always remembered me as her little 8-year-old, Mija, and she would be like, "Gabby, where's Gabby?" And I'd be like, "No, I'm right here." She'd be like, "Oh yeah." So having me kind of be like, "Hey, let's go eat," or let's, watch a movie. She'll be like, "Don't be bossy." And I'm like, "I'm not trying to be bossy." So just basically, because she remembered like she was like the old adult and I'm the child. So that was kind of fun to balance on my end, because I'd be like, "Come on, just sit with me." "No, I don't want to." I'm like, "Okay." But she was also great, because I'd be like, watch me," when I was like 5 all the time, and she totally watched me. But anyways, so with that being said, we did reach a point though where she fell in our kitchen and broke her hip. And at that time, she had to do a full, like a hip replacement. She had to go to the peaks. My poor Nana had to relearn how to walk, which is a challenge, but she learned and conquered that obstacle. I believe someone mentioned music, and that was something else that totally helped our family get by, as we would play some music and she would sit and she would dance and she would start to sing, and that would also bring back like old childhood memories. So that was something that was always fun to listen and talk about. But yeah, so after she broke her hip, she definitely battled and tried to walk as much as she could, but as time progressed, she really started to wasn't really able to walk with the walker by assisted as much anymore. So she became more of wheelchair bound and relied on my family to transfer her to wheelchair to bed and bed to wheelchair and so forth. So at that time, she became less physically active, and not only with that, we were also experiencing that her swallowing wasn't as best as it should have been. Her interest in food wasn't as great as it was, as well as, being hydrated. So during that time, we really had to learn how to, we reached a point where we were using like a little syringe and putting it in the corner of her mouth and giving her a little bit of water to help her. We would have to like help rub her neck to remember to like initiate her muscles to swallow. as well as my mom would try to make as high calorie dense dishes as we possibly could, but in smaller portions per se. So my Nana would used to joke that she was a monkey because she used to eat bananas all the time. So we would give her like a banana and some, we would give her a banana with peanut butter, and we would just kind of help her feed it with her. So yeah, my mom definitely tried to do the best in making high calorie options for her, but with fewer meals. Same thing with like using our insures and things like that, as well as getting her hydrated. My family would have like two big little like Gatorade bottles that we would try to make sure she would have enough water every day. So my family really did go above and beyond to make sure we were reaching her nutritional values and making sure that she was staying hydrated and being as active in her wheelchair as she could have been at the time.
Thank you, Gabby. You've all shared so many experiences of caring for your loved ones, but also of some stressful situations and some grief. How did you care for yourself at the same time? And do you have any advice for any good self-care practices? Tim, we'll start with you.
Okay. One thing that had really concerned me, and I have accepted this as truth, that I was told that spouse caregivers often don't survive the loved one. And that really resonated with me. I thought, well, that's good to understand that self-care is important. I don't know that I did much of that. Although as we went along, I learned with the caregivers that I maybe shouldn't be so frugal. And on the weekends, it would be okay for me to have them come in, and I would go off running or something that was just a little bit of me time. And that was really helpful. So just to kind of get away a little bit was useful. During much of the time during COVID, I was at home with my wife and working from home and do frequently. So I was around quite a bit. So just an opportunity to get away was very helpful. We had spotted a care home here in town that we were on a waiting list for prior to COVID. And I had taken her over to their place. They had a space to just do a daily respite. And that was a wonderful service. I really wished I could have leaned into that more. But then COVID hit and all the care homes pretty much shut the doors, and that was that. But if you was able to find that service, I would recommend it, just to have a day. It also, at that point, was part of my strategy to get her comfortable with that particular facility. So when the time came, I had anticipated that that would happen. In terms of self-care, I realized about a year and a half before she passed that this was having an adverse effect on my physical health. And I wasn't able to do anything about it because COVID happened at that time. But I guess my suggestion is, as you go along this as a caregiver, spousal caregiver at least, there will be a point when you realize this is beyond my abilities as a caregiver. And just be aware that that point will arrive, and to have a plan is what I'd suggest.
Good advice. Thank you, Tim. Patty?
And for me, I would just say you got to find that thing that kind of recharges you in the brief amount time that you have. And so for me, I mean, I had 3 teenagers at home, as well as trying to manage through this. And so besides doing some quick walks, my thing was audiobooks. I did a lot of driving from Flagstaff to Prescott, and then I actually worked some in Phoenix. So I would just, as soon as I was getting in my car when I was leaving and heading home, or whatever the case would be, I would listen to that audiobook and just let my brain empty and just totally, I just think those times of just totally clearing my mind was something that really helped me kind of recharge. But everyone has that different thing, but for me, that's what worked.
Thank you, Patty. Karen?
I didn't know anything about self-care. I was working full-time and visiting my mother when I wasn't working. I now know that taking care of yourself is so important because the rate of caregivers predeceasing the person they're caring for is very, very high because you're not taking care of yourself physically, emotionally, spiritually. And you get to the point where you feel I have to do it all. And if I'm not doing it, I'm failing. And that's not true. It just becomes a tremendous burden on you. And what I recommend is have a short list that you keep on the refrigerator. So when people say, let me know if there's something I can do for you. Well, you know your neighbor's a good cook and you say, gee, you know, if you could just make some macaroni and cheese, you know, some freezer packs, that would be wonderful. Sometimes people offer, but they don't know what it is they can do for you. So it takes the burden off. These are the things that I could use. You know, maybe it means when your loved one is taking a nap, you sit and have a cup of tea, grab your book, listen to some music, go outside in the garden, whatever brief time you can grab for yourself is so very, very important. Take care of yourself so you'll be there for your loved one.
Thank you, Karen. Gabby, do you have any advice?
Well, for myself, I was very fortunate where my mom would still, encourage me to go be a kid and go hang out with my friends and have time. So I really appreciated that. However, I acknowledge that her and my aunt both went through a lot of stress where, they were taking care of their loved one. And then, once they had their opportunity to go home, they still were worried that they had all this stuff they had to do at home. Or in my mom's case, like she also had my brother and we were still young, or taking care of her home and things like that. My biggest advice overall is just acknowledging that it's okay if you have a few things you have to do. And it's definitely important to realize that you need to take care of yourself. And if that requires you going on a walk for an hour, go for that walk. Because if you have laundry in your living room, your laundry will still be there when you come back. But it's definitely important to make sure you're making yourself a priority, or setting, a certain time for you to do your happy thing that brings you joy, instead of just constantly worrying about your loved one and then worrying about your own personal life that you have to continue. So definitely setting that time for you is really important. And knowing that it's okay is the biggest thing. Definitely.
Thank you, Gabby. And I have one final question for the panel, and then we'll move into our question and answers from the audience. So they say hindsight is 20/20. Can you briefly share with us one thing you wish you had known at the beginning of your journey? Tim?
Well, the tough thing is, having gone through this, I now feel like I understand so much more than I did before, but I don't know how I could possibly have had that kind of knowledge before this. So I guess perhaps if we had gotten an earlier diagnosis, it wouldn't have changed the outcome, but it might have allowed us as a couple to make a little bit more time for things. Because there was no time for the things we'd been living for in retirement. So if we'd known it was coming, and I think there's a little bit better opportunity maybe out there to get a little bit earlier heads up nowadays than there was. So that, when we were going, oh, we're getting a little bit older, maybe our memories are just, that's the way they're supposed to be. Maybe if we recognize that, it might have made the years between that and when the diagnosis a little bit different and a little bit more special.
Thank you, Tim. Patty?
Yeah, and I think for me, I would say, kind of reiterating almost what Karen said, is that every day is a new day, but more like there's the stages, and just because something works you know, I guess I never thought of it. I just thought there'd be just one long. I didn't think about the digression, I guess, or the progression of the disease. So I would just say, again, reiterating what Karen said, is be flexible, make your loved one feel comfortable, and it's just going to change day to day what works and makes them happy. But I mean, and I think that you know, the best thing you can do is, again, enjoy those little joys in each day that you can find of your experience with your loved one that you're caring for.
Thank you, Patty. Karen?
I'm going to have to go quick because I have a few things to share. One is when you are given a prescription for medication related to any form of dementia, research the medication. There are some that can be detrimental depending upon your loved one's other health issues, and it can make things really unpleasant. The other thing I had learned was about taking a virtual dementia tour. I found this to be emotionally very difficult, but had I done this, had I known about it, I would have understood so much more of what my mother was going through, because the tour makes you, they put goggles on you, so you can't see clearly. They cover your ears, you can't hear clearly. They put gloves on, so when you go to grab something, your tactile sense is gone. And they cover your feet with something that makes it hard to get around. And you really need to understand what your loved one is going through. I had the good fortune to discover years after my mother passed Dementia Friends USA, and I researched it, and I have become a Dementia Friends champion. And I am a volunteer, and I offer a 1-hour information session based on the education I have received from Banner Alzheimer's Institute. And this is how I give back for what I didn't have. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Gabby?
For me, I would say thinking outside the box is okay. For example, we would never ever think that we would give my nana a syringe with water. So little things like that will help you care for your loved one. It's okay. It might be outside the box and it may not be in the textbook per se to care for someone, but sometimes you need to be creative to, you know, better their needs and things like that. And for example, my nana also had like really bad arthritis, and we would give her a little dash bottle that she would have to hold and put a little like old sock on her hand to help her, you know, continue to stretch those hand muscles so she's not constantly clenching. So things like that of being creative and thinking outside the box is also very creative, and don't be afraid to do that.